Hello and welcome to Spare or Thought, the podcast for curious minds exploring creativity, culture and stories from the margins. I'm your host, Tom Spare. If you're a returning listener, you'll have noticed the show has a slightly different feel lately. I've drawn more and more to the creativity and culture side of things and to the subject that just sit outside of the mainstream. Today's episode is very much in that spirit. I'm joined by my friend Bee. Bee, welcome to Spare a Thought. Could you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Bee. I'm a multidisciplinary designer and architecture graduate, and I work across graphics, spatial design and illustration. And I'd say I'm very interested in how design can communicate ideas and bring people together.
Wonderful. This is your first podcast?
This is my first podcast. Does it show?
Okay. Get her an agent already.
Yeah.
We're already advertising Bee services here. So if you like any of the above, please reach out. Today we're talking about the life of Tadao Ando, so Japan's self-taught architect who's had a huge impact on modern Japanese architecture. We're releasing this episode during Golden Week in Japan, one of the country's 3 busiest holiday seasons, alongside New Year and Oban Week, and also there's cherry blossom season as well, but that's not quite the same thing. And it's a collection of 4 national holidays within 7 days.
The 4 national holidays that make up Golden Week are Shower Day on the 29th of April, the birthday of the former Emperor Showa, who died in 1989. And then there's also Constitution Day on the 3rd of May, marking the day in 1947 when Japan's new post-war constitution came into effect. And then there's also Greenery Day on the 4th of May, dedicated to the environment in honour of the Emperor's love of plants and nature. And then there's also Children's Day, which is on the 5th of May, when families pray for the health and future success of their sons by hanging cups, streamers and playing samurai dolls, symbolizing strength, power and success in life. And the Girls' Festival is celebrated separately on the 3rd of March.
It's also, just as a point of interest, so Emperor Showa was the emperor during World War II. So he had an incredibly long reign, and when he was emperor in the lead up to the Second World War, I think he became emperor pretty young. The Second World War happened, and he was designated like, a representative of not God, because obviously in Japan there's different sort of religions and everything in Buddhism and Shinto and so on. But he's like the Earth's representative, basically.
Oh wow!
Type vibe. So he was basically like a medieval ruler in many senses, and had a huge entourage around him, lots of power and prestige. And then after the war, he continued to be the emperor, but he then was more of a figurehead. He didn't have any constitutional power. And Constitution Day, the Americans wrote the constitution for Japan after the Second World War. They occupied Japan for about 6 or 7 years entirely. So it was under like US military command. The Japanese had initially come up with a constitution, but the Americans said this is not what we need, and we need to get rid of it. So they were very, very controlling in how sort of decided to go next. And part of that constitution was to not have a standing military.
Got you. Okay.
So it then became the sort of Japanese Defence Force. So that's a little bit of the context around that. I also have a personal connection to Japan. My oldest brother, Matt, who featured on the show earlier in the year for the podcast series about my grandfather's book, lived in Japan between 2002 and 2004. And then when he moved back to the UK, he met his wife, my sister-in-law, Mayuko, who grew up in Okayama. And then our brother Dave has lived in Japan for close to 20 years with his wife, Ai-chan, who's also Japanese, and their son, my nephew, Hugh. And it was actually Dave who introduced me to Tadao Ando. He's taken photographs inside at least one of the buildings that he designed. And I've also visited Japan myself twice, in the winter of 2015 and 16 and the spring of 2019. So Japanese culture and Japanese family have been in my life since 2002. So
Wow.
the vast majority of my life. So I was like 8 or 9, and when you're that age and you have an introduction of a new culture, it can be like very impressionable. And I've actually still got emails from my brother Matt of when he was in Japan and I was like 8 or 9. It's just all the sort of like non-interesting questions I'm asking Matt. Like now, if he was there, I'd be like, it'd be an entirely different situation.
Yeah, you should do the same thing, but no.
Yeah, exactly. So Bee, you studied architecture at university. Did you ever come across Ando and his work?
Not directly, but we did do a lot of precedent studies at uni, which basically you look at different spaces and buildings to sort of understand what influences your work. It was kind of like you're almost building this library of references and inspiration, but his work has come up in that context before, especially in terms of like how he uses light and materials to like shape a space, and how he thinks about program and how people move through a building and experience it over the time. And then also I do remember looking at, I think, the Benesse House Museum, which and like how it sits within and frames the landscape and its surrounding environment, which was really cool when I found out about it at the time. But then as well as that, it's like how its layout kind of guides you through a space in a really, really organic and quite fluid way. And I think that's something that you can see is carried throughout a lot of his work.
Yeah, and that subject of light and how he builds, or how he designs his work into the land. They're often like dug in.
Yeah.
They're often sort of like hidden, aren't they, rather than on huge display. So I've seen even something, there's a huge statue of Buddha, and Buddha's head is just sticking out the top, whereas the rest of it is hidden underneath and then surrounded by grass. So it's always like, there's always quite a surprise in his work.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yeah. We'll start off with early years in boxing then. Tadao Ando was born on the 13th of September 1941 in Osaka, Japan, just months before Japan entered the Second World War following the attack on Pearl Harbor. He grew up in the Asahi ward of the city, a working class district in what was, by the time he was forming his earliest memories, a country rebuilding itself from complete devastation.
Osaka is Japan's third largest city and has always had a distinct identity from Tokyo. So it's mercantile, more direct, with a reputation for being a city of makers and traders. I believe it's also like the city that's produced lots of Japan's comedians.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I remember we were to go out for celebrating New Year's, and Dave put the TV on, and there's this like group of Osaka like comedians who do like really silly things to make each other laugh, and through the episode it all becomes more and more extreme. A lot of it usually relates to them being chased and like being beaten up by random figures. So it's like it's just very, very bizarre type of humor. It's also a city where Ando has based himself his entire life and career. Almost all of his significant buildings are rooted there or nearby or inspired by. And it's also where Japan's soul food comes from. So if you want a real taste of Japan, you go to Osaka. Takoyaki, which is like octopus balls, okonomiyaki, which is savory pancakes, kitsune udons, which are noodles with a sweet fried tofu, and kushikatsu, which is deep fried skewers, which are delicious. And also, I learned this from my brother yesterday, katsu means fried. So
wow,
deep fried. So that's why like katsu curry is called katsu.
Oh wow.
There we go.
I'm gonna now like think about that every time I go somewhere. Ando grew up alongside his twin brother, raised primarily by his maternal grandmother after his parents separated. Separation in Japanese culture then, and even now, I think is very rare. It was perhaps another sign he was different from everyone else.
Yeah, and he sort of stood out a little bit. My sister-in-law told me once about Japanese society. They have a saying which is, do not be the nail that sticks out from the wood. So it's sort of you sort of have to go with the flow as a general thing. Individualism isn't necessarily as celebrated as it is in other places. So lots of like advances are because of the collective rather than the individual, which is quite interesting. And it's something to bear in mind because Ando went against a lot of Japanese norms as well. And that could be something to do with the fact that he had an unconventional upbringing. So he left school, and like many young men of his generation with energy and ambition but limited options, he turned to boxing. He became a professional 4-round boxer.
In a Vanity Fair interview last year, he was asked how boxing shaped his approach to architecture, and this is what he said. A boxer stepping into the ring with gloves, an architect sketching with a pencil. At first glance, they seem like completely different professions, completely different ways of life, but to me, they are the same in one crucial way. Both are battles where you must overcome your own fears and move forward with courage.
And Ando continues, boxing is an intensely solitary and disciplined sport. You push your body to its limits through relentless training and weight cuts, only to throw everything into a fleeting moment in the ring. There is nothing to rely on but your own body. Yet in those extreme conditions, there's a new strength that is awakened. Architecture is no different. When the constraints are tight, when the program and budget leave little room for freedom, that's when you are forced to ask yourself, what is truly essential? What must I create? And at the end of that struggle, light emerges. For example, in 1989, I built the Church of the Light in Osaka on an ultra-low budget. That building was born precisely because of such extreme conditions. What I find really striking about that quote is the phrase, when the constraints are tight, that is when you are focused to ask yourself, what is truly essential? And that's not just a philosophy of architecture, that's a philosophy of creativity, full stop.
And it connects directly to how he learned architecture because he had no money or no formal training, and I don't believe he could afford university or even afford a vocational school. So he bought the same textbooks that that the students at the University of Tokyo were using, sat down with them and just read every day.
And there's something like almost monk-like about that image, you know, just sitting with the books until they make sense. Ando said in an interview, I'd sit there all day long with architecture books. If you sit there continuously, you start to feel like you understand it. And also, again, I was having this discussion with my brother that Japanese society is very much dominated by what university you went to. It's very much like a status thing, particularly at that point. So lots of professions that you wouldn't necessarily think would need a university education do. So like a lot ticket collectors on the Shinkansen on the bullet train, you have to have a university degree to be a ticket collector, for example.
Wow.
Or it's like massive, it's very encouraged. Like these are discipline and status are very, very important in this part of the world.
And the other thing that shaped him was the moment he quit boxing. He was training one day when he watched the world champion fighting her out of practice, and he said immediately he recognized that the gap between them was insurmountable. And his words were, the level was completely different. I gave up decisively and I quit immediately.
The other lesson he took from boxing was about self-reliance. He said, in boxing, no one helps you. In architecture too, no boss or anyone else will help you. That mental toughness forged in the ring and refined through years of solitary study is the foundation of everything else that is built on. Travel and self-education. So Ando taught himself the theory of architecture through sheer determination, a pile of borrowed and bought books, but theory alone wasn't enough. He needed to actually experience the buildings themselves. And so in the 60s, with no money, no foreign language skills, and no safety net, he got on the Trans-Siberian Railway and travelled to Europe.
Yeah, wow, that is a big deal. That's not an easy thing to do.
No, it's not. It sounds really exciting, but the idea of not having a safety net, it to me just
Yeah, I don't think I would be able to do that.
It'd take like months of planning. I think for him, it might have been a bit thing of off the hoof. What did he do when he got there? He walked for miles. So every single day, he said, walking while looking and thinking, arriving somewhere and thinking again, living and thinking while walking. That's not sightseeing. That's a completely different relationship with the built world. So he's sort of looking at the world around him.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because at university we were taught to sort of analyze buildings through drawings and theory, but we were also very much encouraged to visit sites and experience spaces firsthand, which is something that I really liked that we did at uni. But Ando's path feels a bit more rooted in entirely in that, learning through being in spaces. So it's interesting how those two approaches overlap.
And I would say, like, that's the way education should be, that you should be placing yourself, because like, for example, I did political communication for my MA, and I knew a lot about the theory, but I didn't actually have that much hands-on experience of how you apply that theory into the working world. And I think, again, that was the same with my politics degree as well, of my undergrad, that I didn't do a year abroad, or I didn't do a year in industry. And it makes such a big difference because, you look at, say, like media theory and media ownership, but then you've got the reality of being a journalist. Ultimately, they're just trying to do their job. So you can be as critical as you like about who owns the media, but they're pursuing a career and trying to do the best that they can.
Yeah.
And I think the same applies here as well, in a different sense. So it's worth saying that Ando wasn't entirely without formal learning. He attended night school to learn to draw, and he took supplementary correspondence classes in interior design. But these were like the building blocks, not the education. The real classroom was being in the world and experiencing the world around him.
And two buildings in particular changed everything for him. The first was the Pantheon in Rome, and he watched people singing hymns inside, and he saw how the light poured down from the oculus in the ceiling, and he described it as truly an architecture of light. That single experience planted the seed of everything he would go on to build.
The second was Le Corbusier's Notre Dame de Haute in Ronchamp, France. He said, lights both beautiful and intense poured down on the backs of people huddled together in prayer. It was solemn yet gentle, embracing their hearts. At that moment, I realized this was the ideal space I had been seeking. One can create architecture simply by pursuing light.
Yeah, so I guess that moment in Ronchamp is the direct origin of the Church of the Light. He even said, since then, I have continued my pursuit of light to this very day, and it all began in the space of Ronchamp.
What strikes me is that he came from a tradition of Japanese architecture that already understood the relationship between light, shadow, and space profoundly. The temples he grew up with near Nara and Kyoto. Nara, just as a sidebar, was the original capital of Japan before Kyoto and before Tokyo. So it's like a very ancient capital. And it's famous for its deer. Deer are like roaming about, and they will often pick in your pockets because they're always looking for food.
Wow.
Start nibbling. And deer are meant to be like the messengers of the gods, basically. They are sort of representatives on Earth. And the quiet atmosphere of those spaces. I mean, Nara is just so peaceful. And although Kyoto is an incredibly busy city, you can just turn up into a shrine or a temple, and it's just, silence, So you've got overhanging roofs, the verandas. He was absorbing that from childhood without even realizing it.
And then he goes to Europe and finds the same truth expressed through completely different materials and a completely different culture. That collision, Japanese sensibility meeting Western modernism, is where his architecture is born.
He also encountered the work of Frank Lloyd Wright during his travels, who interestingly had his own deep connection to Japan. Wright had lived and worked in Japan and was profoundly influenced by Japanese aesthetics, so the exchange was going both ways.
And then by 1964, Ando had opened his own architecture practice, and he was in his early 20s. Oh, wow, that is very young. Self-taught with no degree, no connections and no clients, just a fighting spirit and a head full of buildings he had walked through on the other side of the world.
I mean, this would make for a great LinkedIn post, wouldn't it? Like, you know.
Yeah,
welcome
what
back
I've
to
learned from my travel.
the interesting thing. So, one of the reasons I brought you on here, Bee, was your excellent recommendation of suggesting to talk to Civic Square, and I talked to Charlie from Civic Square about neighborhoods of the future, which I did last year. In that, he was talking about the interesting thing that in the 1960s and 70s, 50% of architects were employed by the state, right? They were employed by the British state. And now I think it's like less than 2% or something like that.
Yes.
And you had all of these young architects like Ando who had just come out of their training, but they'd gone to university, come out of training, and then they were designing these massive social projects.
Yeah. I remember when Charlie said that on your previous podcast, I was just like, wow, because it's shifted so much since then. And you can really tell from even like the way we practice, because I think he also mentioned something about how like the way we're taught at university is still sort of within that, like that's still connected to how architects back then would maybe design, whereas like the way it all works now is quite different.
I really think that's the interesting disconnect between the ideology of the teaching versus the reality of the moment.
Yeah.
And I think there is something because in the UK we're very nervous around ideology. We try to avoid it at any cost. Like the idea of there being an ideological right wing or left wing, or, you know, a lot of people get nervous around the idea of an extreme.
Yeah.
But the reality is that we're sort of setting lots of folks up for failure, particularly university students, to train them for a world that doesn't exist. And that's something that I'm very passionate about, is that we need to sort of douse people in a bit more reality.
Make a bit more applied as well.
So a new Japanese modernism. So by the time Ando opened his practice in 1964, he had a clear philosophy forming in his mind. So by this point he's 23, but philosophy needs material to work with, and the material Ando chose was one that nobody in Japan was using quite in the same way: bare exposed concrete.
And it's important to understand that for Ando, concrete isn't just a structural base that gets covered up and decorated afterwards. It is the final surface. So what you see is what it is, raw, unpainted, and completely exposed.
Which sounds simple, but actually makes the process extraordinarily demanding, because the moment the concrete is poured, that's it. There's no second chances, no touch-ups, no hiding of mistakes. The final expression of material is decided in that single moment. I was thinking about this when doing the research, and then watching, you know, interviews with him, videos of his work, looking at the pictures of his work. I always think about when a building is being constructed, say in the UK, and you see the bare lift shaft.
Oh, yeah.
And that is like the material that contains the lift shaft is the final product of his work. So in the UK and other places, we're always sort of covering those things, but for him, that's the final product. So Bea, is this something that you're familiar with in your studies in design?
Yeah, I guess so. I think what I really valued about how we were taught at university was that it was very iterative, and we were always encouraged to test things and like occasionally change materials and just let the design evolve. There were definitely times where I changed my materials quite a lot, but also there were very much I've had moments where I knew exactly what I wanted something to be made from. Personally, I was kind of always a bit more drawn to wood than concrete, but I do think there is something really beautiful about concrete when it is used in that way. I still love looking at buildings that use it like so intentionally. It feels very honest. And I think with his work, I really like the idea that something that I guess can maybe be perceived as heavy can be used to create something really light and calm.
Yeah, because when I think of concrete, I think of like initially I would think of like multi-story car parks and stuff like that. It's not necessarily something in my head that would represent beauty.
Yeah.
But when you see his complement of, he doesn't build up, he sort of builds down.
Yeah.
And builds part of, and often a lot of his work are on like islands, or they look out onto beautiful scenery, so that then the design, yeah, exactly, yeah, they frame the scene, or they become part of nature, basically. And I suppose that's Japanese relationship to nature itself. And Ando's very clear that achieving that standard isn't down to him alone. So he talks about the craftsmen, the carpenters, the plasterers, who treat the pouring process with what he describes as extreme reverence and precision. The success of the concrete, he says, ultimately depends on how much pride they take in their work. That, to me, is where the true essence of architecture lies.
And I think there's something in that idea of craft and attention to detail that's often kind of associated with Japanese design, where the making processes really show in that final object or thing, really, or building.
Exactly, yeah. Ando's first major statement with this material came in 1976, so 50 years ago, with the row house, also known as Azuma House in Osaka, and it caused a real stir. From the outside, it looks like a small windowless concrete box, which, to be fair, is essentially what it is.
And inside, Ando did something that some people considered almost perverse, I guess. He placed a fully open air courtyard right in the middle of the home, not at the side, on the back, just right in the middle, which means to get from the bedroom to the kitchen or the bathroom, you do have to go outside.
Maybe in Japan, where the climate is a bit more temperate, that's fine.
I mean, I was going to mention here very much so in the rain and cold, inside your own house, that would be a bit tricky. But I think what is interesting is the idea of moving between inside and outside, even within a home. And I really liked actually looking at that in my own studies back at uni. It's something I have also seen quite a bit in South Asian homes, where spaces aren't always completely enclosed. Like a lot of my family members, they have similar things happening in their homes. And I think it makes you more aware of the environment as you move through them. And I think it could also come from, like we just mentioned, the climate and the lifestyle. Some semi-open spaces can help with airflow and cooling, but I do think they also reflect a way of living that's a bit more connected to the outside. And I think they work really well because they can be like these communal spaces that do hold this sense of privacy, but you can also gather and share the space, but it doesn't feel too exposed. And to me, they feel quite contained in a nice way, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And he faced intense criticism for this, but I find that throughout history that the people that are mavericks are like only sort of considered are only celebrated later on. And you see that in like films and various other things, but at the time it seemed as like contentious, and it's I suppose it's not hard to see why. It's a genuinely uncomfortable imposition on people living there, but his philosophical intention was profound. He wanted the inhabitants to live in constant direct dialogue with the cosmos, I suppose, with the world around them, to feel the rain, to look up at the open sky, to experience the changing light within their daily lives. One of the properties that he designed in Osaka, I watched this YouTube video, and these two architect enthusiasts are going around the property, And the owner that lives there now, it's now like an exhibition space, but the owner added an extension, and as soon as they moved into the extension, the temperature changed completely.
Oh wow.
Because they used, because it's designed with exposed concrete,
Mm.
the insulation's really poor.
Yes. Yeah.
So it just lets in the cold, so it just absorbs what's ever going on outside. So if it's really hot, it's really hot inside, and if it's really cold, it's really cold inside. And I was thinking as well, like, that would just be so crap in this country. You just couldn't have exposed concrete because it's so like damp and humid, It's like...
Yeah. He described that open courtyard as a modern translation of the traditional Japanese engawa, the veranda. That liminal space between inside and outside that is fundamental to traditional Japanese architecture. He was taking something ancient and expressing it through the most industrial of modern materials.
Yeah, and I hadn't really thought about that because when I went to Himeji Castle, which is absolutely awesome, it's one of those old traditional big Japanese castles. That's a white castle, and it has beautiful gardens at the back of it. And when I was doing the tour, so you go in, you have to take your shoes off. You can't wear shoes inside. Yeah. And it's beautiful, smooth wooden flooring. You just sort of feel like you're part of the castle.
Yeah.
But the people said that showing us around, there's not a single nail in the whole building.
Oh wow.
So it's all slotted together.
Yeah, slotted. Yeah, like Japanese joinery.
Yeah. Which is really cool. But in the garden, there was a Japanese tea ceremony. You could go to a Japanese tea ceremony. And the way those buildings are laid out, that there is like verandas, and then you go outside, usually a bridge, and then like a little island, and then the tea room is in the middle. I did get told off by quite an elderly Japanese lady for not doing it properly, so I felt it felt like I was back in school again. And I was also fully aware that I was a Westerner in Japanese life, and I was just like, oh god, this is going terribly wrong. So there's that tension between the ancient and the modern, the natural and the artificial, the comfortable and the challenging, and it's at the heart of everything he does. He said architects are tormented by the constant conflict of these dualistic propositions. The deeper and the more intense the tension is, the more dynamic the creation becomes.
And the Gutai movement is worth mentioning here too. This was an avant-garde art movement founded in Osaka in the 1950s, and Ando was influenced by it in his early years. Their mantra was simple but quite radical. Don't copy anyone else. You have to create your own movement. That spirit of absolute originality runs through everything he has built.
And the other building that captures this new Japanese modernism beautifully is the Honpuguji water temple of Owaji Island, completed in 1991, where the row house forces you to confront the sky from within a box. The water temple takes the opposite approach. It pulls you underground.
And visitors approach a large pond filled with lotus plants, and the lotus being the symbolic origin of Buddhism. And then rather than entering a building in the conventional sense, you walk down a staircase underneath the water itself to reach the main sanctuary.
That's pretty cool, isn't it?
That's very cool.
That does have slight Bond villain vibes. Just imagine some like sharks going.
Yeah.
And when you get there, the interior is painted entirely in bright vermilion. And in the late afternoon, when the western sun strikes the sky, the entire room glows with this radiant spiritual red. This underground chamber beneath a lotus pond burning with light.
And I think it's such a good example of what he does, taking the most austere, minimal approach on the outside and then delivering something completely unexpected and emotionally overwhelming on the inside, the restraint and the revelation.
Which brings us to the building that perhaps most embodies all of this, the one that distills everything Ando believes about light, concrete, constraint, and the void into a single, almost impossibly simple structure.
I guess this brings us perfectly onto the power of the void. The Church of the Light is located in Ibaraki, a suburb of Osaka, and was completed in 1989. It is, by any conventional measure, an extremely modest building, a small concrete box seating around 100 people, built on an ultra-low budget for a local congregation of the United Church of Christ.
And there is a surprising amount of Christians in Japan, and quite a few churches. A lot of them were in the cities that were like the merchant cities. So, it's Nagasaki, think about Kobe and places like that. But when you go to Kobe, the streets are very wide. It does have almost like a European feel. Part of that is also shaped, though, by the Kobe earthquake in the mid-90s, which also had a huge impact on Ando, and he played a big part in sort of reconstruction and design. It's considered like a really significant religious building of the 20th century. It's appeared on virtually every list of the greatest works of modern architecture. People travel from all over the world to sit inside it.
So what is it? What makes it so extraordinary? Because from the outside, it feels incredibly minimal and almost like nothing is revealed.
And that's exactly the point. So Ando cut a cross-shaped void directly into the concrete wall behind the altar, not decorated, not framed, not gilded, just an absence. A gap in the wall in the shape of a cross, through which natural light pours into the dark interior.
And because the walls, the floor, and the ceiling are all bare concrete, dark, quite absorbative, and completely unadorned, that light becomes the entire focus of the space. There is nothing else competing for your attention, just the cross of light on the wall, shifting and changing as the day moves.
He spoke about this in an interview, and the language he used is striking. He said, "The void does not mean a neutral zero space. It is like a white canvas that reflects the changes of nature, such as light and wind. The emptiness is not an absence, it's an invitation."
And I think that's what's really interesting is how disciplined that is. I think most of the time the instinct would be to add and to layer things, and to give something a bit more presence, but he sort of does the opposite and strips it back to almost what's just essential.
Yeah, and if you compare that to like churches, Western churches, they are, particularly the Catholic ones, they're just adorned with gold and bling and stained glass windows, and they're very opulent. Whereas this is like quite pared back, stark, Puritan, actually, I would probably argue. But it makes, what remains is the light. So, which connects directly back to that moment in Ronchamp and to the Pantheon in Rome and to those textbooks he sat with all day in Osaka. Everything in his life pointed towards this building.
And I think there's something else worth knowing about the Church of the Light. Ando's original vision was actually even more radical than what was eventually built. He wanted the cross-shaped opening to have no glass at all. He wanted the wind and the cold to enter the space along with the light, and the barrier between the inside and the outside to be completely dissolved.
He was eventually persuaded to install glass for practical reasons. So I suppose that's like the compromise between the visionary and the reality. So rain, winter, temperatures, don't affect it. But he never entirely let go of that original vision. He still speaks of the building as a living entity. And he says he dreams of one day removing the glass to achieve what he calls his absolute void.
And I think that's quite telling, actually, about how he sees the work. It doesn't feel like something that's ever fully finished, and it's still kind of becoming what it was always meant to be.
And the concept of the void runs throughout his work. It's not unique to the Church of the Light. We saw it in the row house, where the open courtyard is the void at the heart of the home. We saw it at the water temple, where the void is the space beneath the pond. In each case, the emptiness is where the meaning lives.
And I think there's a concept often associated with Japanese design, mu, which I believe translates roughly as nothingness, which feels quite connected to this, and this idea that space and spirit hold more significance than physical materials. And Ando spoke about this directly, and he said, I strip away the unnecessary and leave only what is essential. This is my way of creating tension within space.
And tension is the word he returns to again and again, not harmony, not comfort, but tension. The productive discomfort of being asked to feel something you weren't expecting to feel in a building.
And I guess this takes us back to boxing in a way, the ring, the constraint, the moment of clarity under pressure, and it's all the same thing expressed in different forms.
So there's one final detail about Tadao Ando that I think deserves to be said before we close. In 2009 and again in 2014, he underwent 2 major surgeries. He lost 5 organs in total. And his response to that was, even though I've lost 5 organs, as long as my fighting spirit and drive remain, I will never give up creating, because to create is to live.
Which is where the title of this episode comes from.
To create is to live. And I think the new focus of this podcast is sort of shifting more broadly to creativity, to culture, stories from the margins. And the reason why I wanted to do that is there's this growing tension between, what we're creating as humans being challenged by artificial intelligence, by the way in which the creatives are having their work stolen. A lot of people, I was seeing this article in the New York Times about a lot of Gen Z and younger are moving away from digital and getting just functional phones.
They're more analog.
Analog phones and having notebooks and everything.
Yeah.
So that there's an interesting part there, and one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about Ando is that he was a bit countercultural, really, because he's self-taught in a society that's all about teaching and learning. It's all about structure and institutions, but that thing of to create is to live. The creating part doesn't have to be a product. It doesn't have to be have economic value, which I think is essential, that you can live a creative life, which I've done an episode recently on that, to live a creative life. And what are your thoughts on that, Bee?
I think what you said about it doesn't always need to be a product is something that I've sort of been learning over time, and I think something that I've been trying to get myself out of is this idea that it needs to be productive in some way. Is it something that I could sell on afterwards, or will it help me improve my I don't know, something for my career or my future, all of that. But actually just being able to create just for your own sake and for yourself, and not everything needs to almost have this I don't want to call it ulterior motive, but I'm sure that there's an underlying, there needs to be something at the end of this, otherwise there is no point in me doing it. It's something that I'm still learning, and I want to get to a point where I just feel like I can create because I enjoy it. And I remember I did that a lot when I was younger, but I think as I've gotten older, I've almost I remember when I started drawing and illustrating for the first time, I got to 16 and I was like, how can I monetize this? And I don't know, you sort of there was definitely a shift. And actually I want to get back to the point where when I was a kid, I just drew because I was like, this is really cool. I want to do that. And I've got so many sketchbooks from when I was a kid, and I look back at them and I was like, I just drew because I wanted to. That's something I'm definitely working towards. So yeah, that's to create is to live.
I think it's a great philosophy, and it's interesting, as you say, we are almost taught to unlearn our creativity as we get older. What sort of society does to kids is basically, as they transition from being children to adults, is taking creativity away from them, and creativity, curiosity, and a sort of like unfiltered view of the world, of just to absorb and to experience. I went up to Sheffield recently to meet my friend Paul and Lucy's baby, the baby Otis, and it's actually incredible to watch a child see things, to see the outdoors, to see what he's looking at. And in therapy they always talk about like speaking to your inner child and having connection with your inner child, and that's essential for creativity as well. You've got to sort of speak to that person that you used to be, that little kid, because if you satisfy them, you'll be satisfied as an adult, because it's about that sort of ultimate healing experience. So yeah, not to put too much therapeutic language in, but it is an extension of that, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I feel like I'm definitely kind of getting there. I feel like that because of this whole sort of shift back to sort of kind of like, I feel like there is a shift, and I think that I am definitely, I can feel myself just sketching because I want to, or doing something because I want to, and not necessarily feeling like there is an end goal, or like there needs to be something that comes out of this, which I am very much enjoying. And you actually end up becoming you're a bit less like, you take the pressure off yourself, and you actually end up getting to be a bit more creative, because you're like, I'm just doing this because I want to, and there's no added pressure or external thing or factor that's sort of making this happen. Yeah, I think that is a great way to finish, Tom. If you have enjoyed this episode, make sure to rate, comment, subscribe, and share with your friends, family, classmates, and colleagues.
Thank you to you, Bee, for coming on the show. If you enjoyed it,
I have. Thank you very much, Tom. This has been super insightful, and it's just been a really fun time. So please bring me back.
Yeah, I will do. Yeah, and we'll try and find ways of getting you back on the show. Maybe talking about a bit of architecture, a bit of design, but also that connection of what Ando said, which is to create is to live. The title track for this show is Young Shall Grow. Credit and thanks to Afro Cluster, Magugu, and Asha Jane. So Spare a Thought is a Be the Change Media Network production. Thanks for listening, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Even when you know, if you fall, get back up. Young shall grow, whether you like them or not. Young shall grow.